President Biden is hitting the road again this week, promoting the newly passed infrastructure bill. He's heading to a port in Baltimore Wednesday to talk about one of the package's goals, alleviating supply chain issues. Here's how the White House explained the purpose of travel to sell the plan directly to Americans.
And he's been into multiple states doing that over the past several months. Look, that's going to continue. But I think what he wants to make sure is that get this signed, having all the parties, both on the Republican side and the Democratic side, who were very, very instrumental in getting this done. And then we'll continue making sure that we're selling this, talking to the American people.
Democrats are trying to leverage the legislative success ahead of next year's midterms. But debate about the past election continues to shape discourse on Capitol Hill. The House panel investigating the Capitol insurrection is issuing more subpoenas for Trump allies. Included on the list are former White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany and senior advisor Stephen Miller. They are among the 10 people being asked for testimony and documents related to January 6th. That's in addition to the half-dozen subpoenas issued yesterday. That list includes Attorney John Eastman, who reportedly advised that then Vice President Pence could reject the electors of certain states and ultimately deny President Biden's victory. It's yet to be seen if any of those subpoenaed will comply or follow the steps of some other allies of the former president and refuse. Natalie Jennings and David Siders join me now with more. Natalie is a deputy Washington editor for The Washington Post, and David is a national political correspondent for Politico. Welcome to you both. Natalie, let me begin with you. Parts of the White House's plan have been polling high, but so has confusion about what's actually in it. What are we expecting from this latest PR push from President Biden?
From President Biden and from Democrats in Congress who are fanning out to their districts this week after this big passage. They want to connect these issues with the voters who are exactly the sort of voters who are leaving their party right now, who went over to Glenn Youngkin last week. They think those voters, maybe voters without a college degree, are the ones who are going to benefit the most from some of the infrastructure, both in terms of using it and getting the jobs that are going to come from it. They are really banking on this being a way to bring them in. But it's going to be kind of a push, because what we saw last week in Virginia and in New Jersey are a lot of people are leaving Democrats based on cultural issues more than on these economic issues. They favor the policies, but they haven't really connected the White House and what Democrats are doing with how that's going to affect. And we don't know how long it is going to be until they feel those things. So the White House has quite a messaging challenge ahead of them, but they are fanning out to start to tackle just that.
It's a really good point, because what happened in Virginia certainly would have seemed difficult, if not near impossible, perhaps just as recent as a few months ago for the Republican to come out on top. David, let me turn to you. So rank and file GOP lawmakers, meanwhile, are attempting to strip committee assignments from the 13 House Republicans who voted for the infrastructure deal. So what does that indicate about the state of the GOP?
It's remarkable, really, right? I mean, this was a party that was once all about infrastructure. It was Eisenhower's highway program. Ronald Reagan signed a gas tax increase supported by, I think it was more than 100 Republicans in the House at the time to fund infrastructure. And the party just isn't there now. And I think what it really speaks to is how polarized politics is and lawmakers in response, that really it's not about the substance of legislation. It's more about who's getting a win. And the reason these Republicans are being challenged from within their party is because they're seen as handing a victory to Biden, which after last week, when Democrats were so down after Virginia, was really kind of startling.
Yeah, David, I just wonder, for those Republicans then, those 13 House Republicans, how are they attempting to recalibrate? Because if they are operating under sort of this old set of rules and assumptions about getting political credit for things like infrastructure, where does that leave them in this new environment?
There's a couple of things. One possibility is that in a swing district, a ribbon cutting may still matter. It may still matter to go somewhere and to tout having some local achievements, at least in a general election, although it's much trickier in the primary. But the other thing is the same reason that we just heard, I think, rightfully, some skepticism about whether Democrats can sell this plan a year from now. It's that, is the electorate really going to be talking about roads and bridges in a year, or will there be much more salient cultural issues that they're talking about?
Yeah, it's very much an open question. Well, Natalie, the Senate is set to recess until the new year after December 10th, but Congress has to fund the government past December 3rd, pass defense policy and a social spending bill. So how is it all going to get done?
Yeah, those are some pretty big items. And don't forget, they have to prevent defaulting on the national debt as well. So there's not a lot of room for error here. We saw back in October that Democrats sort of held out and waited for Republicans, thinking, especially on that default issue, that they would feel political pressure to get on board. They don't have a lot of time to, just hope that that works out this time if they actually do want to get out of here by December 10th. Or soon thereafter. So they have got to really have a plan, be in lockstep. And we haven't seen Democrats be in lockstep. I think Nancy Pelosi recently said herself, we're not a lockstep party. But they kind of have to be to avert crises, number one. And number two, get this big social spending bill, the other part of the Biden agenda that was not in that infrastructure bill, but that was promised, through the House and the Senate. So it's going to be a really tight timeline. But then again, deadline pressure, as we journalists know, does help get things done sometimes.
Yes, we know that certainly from past deadlines and the coming together at the 11th hour. David, I want to ask about a piece that you wrote in which you said that Democrats do not seem capable of changing course before midterms after dismal off-year election results. What makes you conclude that?
Well, I think this is less so much a conclusion as what some Democrats are thinking themselves, and that is that we've heard this idea that we need to have a different message, that there needs to be a messaging change for a long time, but it never really changes. And there's some reasons that a messaging change wouldn't necessarily fix what is the problem for Democrats right now. Primarily, their policies that they're pushing are pretty popular, right? The infrastructure bill polls well, the stimulus bill that passed earlier this year polled well. And yet you don't see that turning into electoral victories. So the question that I think is, what is the change to make? And there's just broad disagreement about what that should be. It's progressives taking aim at centrists and vice versa. And so it's hard to see one real way in which you would see the party kind of shift its direction ahead of the midterms.
So more of what we have seen heading into the midterms then, despite what took place in Virginia and what we saw take place in New Jersey with Governor Phil Murphy really having a very tight race unexpectedly against the Republican Jack Ciattarelli.
I think that's right. I think you will see more of the same. And the reasons are you'll have progressives saying, well, Terry McAuliffe was a poor candidate. He was too Clinton-esque. It was too much of a centrist. If we just had the right candidates, we would have the right way. And you have moderates saying, really, it's about all this wokeness from the left. And that'll get fought out in the primary. But I don't think that what's going on this week, which is this intense focus grouping in Virginia, is really going to tell us a whole lot new about these voters, which is that it was kind of a wholesale rejection of what the Democrats were offering.
Natalie, let me ask you about New Hampshire. Governor Chris Sununu declined to run for Senate. So what does that mean for Republicans who were hoping to win that seat in next year's midterms?
It is certainly a blow, and I think it surprised a lot of people. All signs indicated that Governor Sununu was going to go for this. It would be a more national position. He was at a big conference this weekend and sounding really upbeat about Republican prospects. Republicans also, are feeling pretty good about their chances in tight races in places like New Jersey and Virginia, and New Hampshire would fall in that category where they might have previously had a tough race. But Sununu said that he doesn't want to join the Senate specifically. It was not a knock directly on Mitch McConnell, but it was a knock on, the effectiveness of what is going on there. He has won 3 times in his governor's race in a state, that is competitive. A Senate race may be a little tougher and more nationalized, and he just wanted to stay and get more done. It also says potentially, if he has any ambitions for, say, a presidential race, that he did not think that the Senate is a place to pursue those, that a governorship is a better spot for him right now.
Well, David, you also wrote about Buffalo's mayor, Byron Brown. He lost to a Democratic socialist, India Walton, in the primary election, yet he kept his seat with a successful write-in campaign. So what are progressives trying to do next?
Well, there's an effort from Our Revolution, which is the Bernie Sanders-aligned group, and some other progressives to strip Mayor Brown, who's a former state party chairman, of his Democratic National Committee seat. I think that's even the people proposing that effort acknowledge it's a long shot, but they plan to do some organizing around that and at least make some waves within the DNC.
All right, we'll keep an eye on that. Natalie Jennings and David Siders, good to have you both. Thank you very much.